more discussion anyway.
James, since he has
Not that they've got chance.
James, since he asked the question, can we answer it real quick?
Okay, go on.
I'll make it fast. This will be very quick. Thank you, Paul, because I think that your articulation of those questions really does get to the issue. Okay, what does it do? The question about the saints walking around, of course, I don't think that's historical. I don't think that saints actually walk around Jerusalem. But the question that social memory theory forces you to ask is not, did this ever happen? But why did Matthew in the first century present it as if it did? Why did they think about Jesus in his activities in these terms?
But
now,
it's not a historical Jesus question.
yes, but the problem of that is not with memory. The problem is with human knowledge. We're not going to answer that question with to our utter conviction as historians, because that type of a question like that is based on someone's belief in the supernatural, etc. So, but my point is, memory itself does not answer, did saints walk around? It forces you to ask, why did they think about Jesus in this way? And there's lots of historical information to be gained from answering that question, right? So, but the fact that memory
But historical information about Jesus, not just about his followers.
about both of them.
Yeah, not just. That's
So for example, the temple cleansing, asking about the temple cleansing, what memory asks you to do is not to choose this one or that one, but whatever scenario you propose as a historical scenario needs to explain why they thought both things, why both types of trajectories exist. Now, it may very well be in the midst of explaining that we come to the conclusion one of them could never have happened and the other could have. I've done these arguments myself. But what memory theory does is structure the way you go about answering the question. It doesn't answer the question for you. So that's my response.
Okay, questions. I think actually, Thomas, did you have your hand up? Can you speak up as well?
Yeah, I have a question I would like you to avoid avoiding. Now, an important point of departure for historical Jesus studies is asking, how do we move from traditions to history? Now, we're learning that criteria, the tradition criteria, don't do the job well. So the question is then, do memory studies do the job? Or are memory studies just a different take on tradition? If the latter is true, we're back to square one. So how do we move from whatever we call it, memory, distorted memories, or traditions, or sources, or whatever, title we give it, name we give it, which is our material to work with. How do we move from that to history? So is social memory just a variant of tradition? And if so, what are we discussing?
I think what's different about memory theory as opposed to tradition in the form critical way is that tradition assumed that you could separate fact from fiction, right? Or layers of embellishment from an original. And memory theory, one of the contributions of memory theory is to say that you can't do that. It's an entirely interpreted. So it's an extension
Yeah,
of
but we work
some of
with tradition many people have worked with tradition for decades without assuming that dichotomy at the point. So what's the difference between tradition in a broader sense?
Well, I'll say quickly, the form critical law assumed that memory was something that reflected essentially accurate representation of the past in the minds of people. And then tradition grew from it and then included interpretation that involved the present, right? In reality, what memory theory does in many respects is pushes that tradition stage up to the front and says at the very beginning they were interpreting these in particular categories. In other words, this distinction between memory and tradition is not nearly as clean as a lot of scholars have thought because there's a lot more overlap. So I don't know if that answers the question. I know Ian said his hand.
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at, but I think that the difference is that tradition isn't the obstacle to be overcome in doing history. Tradition is the vehicle that enables me to know about history.
Yeah. Even if limited.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got here, then here, then here, then here. No,
Hi, thank you so much.
Well, memory distortion theorists are quite clear that while all memory is distorted, some memories are more distorted than others. So the lab work is showing is, for instance, when you do a lab test where you get an adult to reconstruct a childhood story that never happened to them, you know that it didn't happen to them because you're telling them a story that their parents assure you this has never happened to them. You tell the person this happened to you, tell us about it. At first they I have no recollection. A week later, they're starting to form recollections. 2 weeks later, they've got this grand narrative of this thing that never happened to them. So yeah, those memory theorists are assuming because they have evidence that this thing didn't happen, and then here's this manufactured memory of it that is, that can be created, that can be implanted in a person. So yes, flatly, some things happen, and some things, and sometimes memories about that are accurate, and sometimes they're not accurate.
I think it is important to avoid a misunderstanding here. I think there is a misunderstanding involved. The memory studies, as they were applied to historical Jesus research, were never meant to replace historical critical research. It was never the aim of memory studies. It is not a historical method. Memory studies are not a historical method, but it's a hermeneutical perspective. And this hermeneutical perspective was developed in the late 18th and 19th century together with historical critical research. And the clue is that by critical scrutiny of the sources, you will never get an image of the past. You will get an inscription and a coin and a literary source, but you will never get an image of the past. What you need to have an image of a person of the past or of a specific event of the past is you have to use your own, as Colin would call it, creative imagination. And this specific perspective was developed in the 19th century by Johann Gustav Preußen and Wilhelm von Humboldt, and later Robert Collingwood picked that trajectory up. And that means that in doing history, we always have to use our own creative imagination to interpret the source. And this is what memory means, at least as I understand it, and many others as well. We have to use our imagination to create a picture of the past. That does not mean that that it's not important to evaluate the sources critically. That is not an alternative. But you have to distinguish between critical method, as it has to be applied to the sources, there is no doubt about that, and a hermeneutical perspective that we use to do that. And I think it is important to make clear this hermeneutical reflection on what we are doing when we work as historians. And we have to distinguish between these two levels.
It's just that in this case, the hermeneutical perspective renders distinguishing between patently manufactured memory and perfectly plausible memories in the Gospel of Matthew indistinguishable.
But only in a very narrow way.
And the point is, you don't know that at the outset. This is why I said in my paper, memory theory does not do the work for the historian. It only addresses how you're going to handle the sources as interpreted sources.
Except we don't have tools left. You guys took the tools away from us.
we don't
that we've always used to distinguish between.
No. For example, if you look at Johann Gustav Preußen's work, he was a very critical historian, and he evaluated all his sources very critically. But by the same time, he had an idea of what he is doing when he creates, for example, a picture of what he called Hellenism. There is not a contradiction. The critical evaluation of the sources and the hermeneutical reflection on what we are doing when we create a picture of Jesus, that is not a contradiction. It's not an alternative.
And that's right. It's not a contradiction. What's maddening about this discussion is that both Zeva and Paul say, well, here's the rules of historical Jesus research, and you're not following those rules, and so you're not doing historical Jesus research. And both Chris and I have stood up here and said, those rules are bankrupt But knowledge about Jesus is not pushed off the table. Rather, there are other ways of getting at that knowledge. There are other questions to ask, other perspectives at work. And we've talked about those things, and rather than engaging what we've said, you both said, well, you're not playing that game, so you're not doing historical Jesus research. And that's maddening.
No, I respond.
Paul, I think Paul's going to intervene here.
Just because something's maddening doesn't mean that it's wrong. I mean,
but it very well can be.
But how are we going to decide? What I'm saying is, I've given a list of citations about what has traditionally been understood as historical Jesus. You're saying you're doing it at the moment, historical Jesus.
No, I cited some of those same sources and said that is not the game to be played. But so we actually agree that we're not. Yes, we're agreeing with you, but then you don't.
What I'm saying is, the basic question of historical Jesus research that most people would want to know is not about hermeneutical opportunities, because they'd have a difficulty, distinguishing fantasy from fact. So what people want to know is, how reliable are these traditions? And I think Zeb is entirely right. Memory can be distorted, but the basic question or problem is, how do we distort or separate reliable memories from very creative, helpful memories that function really well for pastoral communities? I mean, you know, some of the material in John's farewell discourse has ongoing relevance to believing communities maybe facing times of crisis. And so I want to hang on to that. That is a huge hermeneutical opportunity. If I want to ask, did Jesus ever say anything like that? I'm struggling to see how your method helps me to answer that question. I think what you're saying to me is that question should no longer be on the table. And I think this is a fundamental question that most people would want answered. I think your method answers some very good or important questions, but not those fundamental historical ones. So that's why I think you're doing Jesus research, but not historical Jesus. That's what I think my problem is. If you can help me understand that, I'd be grateful.
Not just now. Okay.
My fellow person from Ottawa there. I agree to you except for your conclusion, unfortunately. While there are many instances where memory can be distorted, there's also many scenarios and situations where there are accurate memories. For example, people who get together every week and sing songs in the pub, they actually memorize words. Or I think everyone in this room will probably give an accurate, short, brief account of the two-source hypothesis. And these things especially occur in teaching situations. So to say I decided to become no quester and follow St. Zeb and spend 6 months, maybe a year following you around, and we sort of, as you went around teaching the good news that the quest is over. I think over that time I have quite an accurate grasp of your teaching. In fact, so accurate, you may even send me out to do other stuff. And it may become a situation where you visit Toronto and a crack-smoking follower of Bob Ford assassinates you. And we decided to continue the teaching. There's a group of us who continue to meet on a regular basis, and, we suddenly realized that, it's not just Saint Zeb, he's the embodiment of wisdom. And we could, carry on sort of, passing on your teaching accurately, and it things from you, and would it be likely distorted? Now, there are going to be things that are distorted, but I think you could create a scenario where you could have quite accurate passing on of the tradition.
Okay,
and so
I am not being heard if I